Okay, welcome everybody. Morning to our session for today. And like last week, and until the rest of the lecture series, we will cover again two different topics today, which today are actually quite unrelated. So the first part will be on creativity, and the second part will be on emotion, and in particular the interplay with emotion and cognition. Okay, let's start with the topic on creativity. After a brief introduction, we will talk about and speak about three different aspects of creativity: the creative product, the creative process, and finally the creative person. Okay, so creativity is of quite a bit of interest, or quite fascinating to a lot of people, and probably one of the reasons is that it is, or a lot of people perceive that humankind really progresses or steps forward mainly by creative acts like big inventions, invention of the light bulb or the washing machine or something like that, or theory of relativity by Einstein. And so there is this perception that everything kind of is stuck for a while, and then there is like the discovery of the wheel as a creative process, and then everything moves forward. And the question is, or one of the big questions in research on creativity is whether this perception actually is true, or whether this is only a perception in hindsight because these things happened hundreds of years ago. We may not know that these big discoveries happened in small successive steps, for instance, and that it wasn't like this big mind-blowing idea all the time. Okay, so let's have a look. When we start about speaking about creativity, of course we have to first start with an idea what creativity is in the first place. And here you have quite a famous painting by Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory, where a lot of people would say, well, that is a creative act, a creative product. Dali has been creative by painting this picture. And there's usually not much discussion about that. Another person which is often associated with creativity is Albert Einstein, who had quite a big contribution to physics, to understanding of the world, and he finally got the Nobel Prize, for instance, in physics. However, what about that? Is that a creative product? What if I tell you these are children's drawings of some kindergarten child? Is that a creative product? What if I tell you that's a piece of art hanging in the New York Museum of Modern Art, a very well-renowned museum? You go there, you think, wow, that's brilliant. And it could be. It was years ago, I went to the Museum of Modern Art, actually in New York, and I was standing there, and there were like an exhibition of photography, and I thought that looks familiar, that picture. And it was an extremely ordinary scene from a German landscape, and I'm from Germany. So, and absolutely nothing special about this. People going fishing at a canal, and no brilliant colors, very dull, and no big feature in there. But it was actually hanging there. It was by an artist which is not maybe too well-renowned, which is, his name is Beuys, and he did like sculptures as well, and he did photography as well. And I, as a psychologist and not as an art expert, couldn't see anything which was special about that painting, but it was actually hanging there. So these are actually children drawings, but I wouldn't be surprised if that would, or a drawing like that would be in some art gallery. Or to reduce that even further, is that an act of creativity or not? Okay, so what is creativity? And usually when we speak about creativity, for a lot of people, it's hard to come up with a definition, because there seems to be something mysterious or extraordinary about creativity. Sometimes we are jealous about people who are creative and we feel that we are not that creative as these people. And naturally it's a little bit difficult to define because there are a lot of different people involved in discussing these aspects. So first of all, creativity is subjective. So what is creative to one person may not be creative to another person. Second of all, it's culture dependent. So especially in the arts, what one culture may define as an act of brilliant creativity, another culture may define as not interesting, ordinary, or something like that. Okay, so when we look at definitions of creativity, these definitions usually consider or incorporate two aspects to creativity. One is that the product of creativity, and product, when we speak about creativity, is a very wide term. It doesn't need to be something physical. An idea can be a creative product as well, a thought or a theory or something like that. So it doesn't always need to be like the wheel or so. So there should be some element of novelty or originality in the perspective of history. And in addition, an element of value or usefulness. And that, of course, is pretty difficult to define. So, for instance, value and use for whom? For the creator, for society as a whole. And how do we measure value? In money or in usefulness, like in everyday applicability? So we have to keep in mind that things like art products are covered here as well. And I already said in the introduction that when we speak about creativity, that we can speak about that from three different perspectives or level of aspects. And one is the creative product, which we'll start in a minute. Second, then will be followed by the creative process. And finally, we will speak about the creative person. Okay, so some methodological considerations here, and that is that actually studying creativity is very, very difficult. And one reason for this is that we have these problems of definition, and if we don't know exactly what we measure, it's very hard to find a good measure of that. Second problem is that truly creative acts are very rare and cannot be easily planned and created in a laboratory situation. So that it's very hard to assess and access these things. However, understanding creativity and the processes and how we can be creative is very, very important and has wide implications for our everyday life, because it had quite an impact for education and training. So if we would know how to train creativity, we could incorporate that into the school curriculum, for instance. And we may even be able to create computer programs which show creativity. Okay, do you have any questions regarding this initial introduction? Okay, then let's start with some considerations about creative products. And this is one product which has been considered to be creative in a way by many people, and it illustrates quite a few things we will discover in this part of the lecture. And this is the first iPhone which came out. And you may know or not that before the iPhone, mobile phones and smartphones were quite different to that. They usually didn't have touch screens. They had regular buttons and things like that. And everything was, like most people would say, more complicated to use. So the iPhone was the first to really bring together the technique of a touch screen and intuitive user interface to use a phone, or to merge a phone, a personal information organizer, media player, and things like that. However, of course, this didn't come out of nowhere. There were smartphones before that who could do all these things, but they were operated differently with a different user interface. There were touchscreens before the iPhone was invented. So all the different parts actually have been there. They only have been recombined into something which then has been termed or considered creative by many people. Okay, so when we think about that, we said an element of novelty or originality, as in the example of the iPhone, can also be something, a new combination of things which already have been there, and an element of value or usefulness which is clearly given with an intuitively usable smartphone. However, when we think about that, then we run into a little bit of a problem when we try to think about wider contexts or more situations. Think about that, a child. And the child has her little play pram here and uses always to carry her doll around in this pram. Now that's the pram for the child, the tool. However, then the child discovers that it could use this pram also as a shopping trolley. Playing a little grocery shop with her friend, and then, oh, we need a trolley. Oh, I could use my pram for that. So we have to ask the question for that situation as well. Is there novelty? Is there value or use of that? And now it depends on the perspective, because for the child, of course, it's something completely new. And it's useful for her. She has a new toy, basically. A new meaning or new thing which she can do. However, for the world, no, it's not, of course. So the perspective is quite important. Or let's take another example. Maybe that in this lecture you think about, wow, what about that study? That would solve a really interesting problem. And you really come up with that study by yourself. And then 2 slides later you see somebody else did that study. Has your thought been a creative thought or not? Because it's not new and original in the knowledge, but it was new original for you. So another problem when we look at this is when we look at artists, which are often considered in the context of creativity. And some creative artists were neglected basically during their time, and only after their death, a long time later or so, people thought, wow, that was really creative what that person did. And other artists were considered to be highly creative during their time, but later, nowadays, we don't have any interest in their paintings anymore, or in their work more generally. So the question is creativity time dependent? And that can be said partly yes, because it changes depending on the context. So with our knowledge, when we think about things like art, we usually are interested in the novelty in the big context, in the knowledge of the world. And that may change with time, so that we think differently. So to get to a little bit broader definition, which captures these difficulties we have, like with the pram example, that we say creativity refers to something new and original to the person, to the creator. And then we get rid of that problem. So when we want to investigate creativity, this insight of the child saying, okay, I can use that as a pram, we would define that as a creative product and as a creative process. So generally, it's much easier for us to investigate creativity in the laboratory. However, we spoke now about the creative product and used that mainly to refine our definition of creativity. However, to be honest, from a psychological perspective, the product is of no real interest to us. What we are really interested in is the process of creativity. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so how can we assess the creative process? That means what happens in our mind during this creative insight, during this point in time. So how was that product was developed in a way? And one of the main methods is self-report. So when somebody invented something big or is deemed to be very creative, we go to that person and ask them. So they later on report how their experience was. However, there's a problem to that, and that is usually that it takes a while to become recognized that a product or something has been creative. And so when we ask such, let's say, popular or famous people, it may be that we ask them years after this creative thinking about what happened. So we have a memory problem here. It may be biased, may be prone to errors, because it's long after that happened. And that's the difference to the verbal protocols which we discovered in our lecture on problem solving. For instance, when chess experts directly verbalize how they solve a chess problem. Because that happens during the thinking. They immediately report what their thoughts are. These self-reports are long time after the thoughts happened. And these self-reports of these famous people, let's say, they are actually one of the reasons why there is something mystical about creativity, because they often have these stories of, oh, I dreamed about that product and then I woke up and created it. Or you dream and you have a weird dream, you wake up and you write a long poem in one go and it's perfect. So there are these incidental stories about big things. Or it is said that Mozart was able to just write a composition without any problems from A to Z. However, as we will see, that may be biased reports, which are actually not that true, and maybe due to that it's long time back. And for instance, there is this example with a rather famous poet who said he did it like that. However, later on, it was discovered that there were previous versions of that poem which showed that he actually did work on that for a longer time. And that doesn't need to mean that these people are lying or trying to deceive. It just can be that it happens to their own memory, that they forget about parts of that and just say, yeah. And maybe they had once a dream about that and got a good step forward in the process, but it's not usually the whole story. And in a more defined way, Wallace in 1926 proposed that the creative process can be subdivided roughly into 4 stages, which we have to go through. And initially there is a preparation stage, so that we have conscious attempts to solve the problem. So, and you may have noticed that already, there is quite a bit of a relationship between problem solving and creativity. Of course, it's not identical, but certain types of problems just ask for creative solutions. So that problem solving and research and creativity share quite a bit of concepts and research here. So we try to get to know the problem. We gather information to solve the problem. However, we may not be able to solve it immediately. So this is a preparation stage. Then, and we heard that as well, and if you think about the time, 1926, that is where the Gestalt psychologists were rather big and popular on the topic of problem solving as well. Then Wallace proposed there is a stage of incubation where we leave the problem aside. And it has often been proposed that there is some unconscious thinking going on in our mind, which works on the problem to find a solution. And during this incubation period, at some point, we have this aha experience, the illumination, the finding of the solution. So it comes as a sudden insight. When you remember the monkey in Köhler's research, They tried to solve the problem, sat in the corner of their cage, obviously doing nothing, incubating, and then suddenly jumped up and solved the problem immediately. And then in humans, he said there is a fourth stage, which is called verification. That means we consciously check whether we found the right solution or not, because that actually maybe not solve our problem. So Wallace puts quite a bit of emphasis on this unconscious processing, on the incubation period in creativity. However, the only real support for that comes mainly from these self-reports of creative scientists and artists who say, yeah, and suddenly I had this insight and I did it like that. But as we've seen, these self-reports are somewhat unreliable. And there are quite a lot of counterexamples which kind of demystify the creative process, or this illumination thing. So for instance, Thomas Edison was a very, very active inventor, and he had like more than 1,000 patents on his own name. And he was the inventor of the light bulb, which actually was then usable in everyday life. So, and he described himself not as a very creative person. He just said it was just hard work. You try, didn't work, so you try another solution or another option. Doesn't work, so you go on trying. So you just work on that continuously with a lot of persistence, and at some point you find a solution which works, after having tried maybe 20, 30 solutions which didn't work, potential solutions. So he said there's nothing special about this. So there's not very much evidence, experimental evidence, which supports that. However, as I mentioned, that's actually quite hard to investigate as well. If you remember the lecture on problem solving, you may remember that we spoke about one way to represent problems is to create a problem space. And this was first proposed by Simon and Newell in the 1960s. And we had the example with the Tower of Hanoi, where you have to put the disks on another peg, so you can create a problem space which reflects all potential moves here. And Simon suggested that creativity is roughly equivalent to problem solving with simple problems. So you can describe that by using this problem space as well. And problem solving, if we look at this or describe that in a slightly different perspective, involves two aspects. And one aspect is control information. So it may be information about the goals and sub-goals. If I have a slightly more complex task, I may have to say, okay, to do that, I have to subdivide that. So suppose your task is to write an essay. And then you may say, okay, I create sub-goals. And my sub-goals are writing, or let's say a lab report. Writing the introduction is one sub-goal, writing the methods is another sub-goal, and so forth. And finally, discussion. So you get a structure, so to say, of your problem, how to approach that. And you may say, okay, I will first write results, then methods, then introduction, then discussion. So you put them into a sequence. And then what you do is that you gather factual information about each sub-goal. So, okay, if I want to resolve the problem of writing the results, what do I need to know? And what do I need to know when I want to write the methods and introduction and so forth? And what Simon proposed is that during this preparation stage of Wallace, where we gather the information, the factual information, we have this control information in our minds, which is kept in short-term memory. And so the factual information which we gather for one sub-goal is kind of like in functional fixedness put to that sub-goal and is not available to the other sub-goals. So it's specific to that. Now, what happens during incubation? And they argue that, or Simon argues, that the control information decays rather quickly because it's stored in short-term memory, while the factual information is stored in long-term memory and is available much longer. So when we say, okay, I didn't solve the problem, let's just put it aside, the idea of having these sub-goals of results and methods and introduction fade away, and we are just left with all the knowledge which we gathered for the different subparts. And that results in the situation that the factual knowledge becomes available to the other sub-goals as well. And so we get a broader information base, which increases the likelihood of finding a solution. So to show that schematically, you have one sub-goal, you gather your facts, you have another sub-goal, so this is preparation stage. You also gather your facts, and during preparation, these facts just are available to the thinking about the sub-goals. However, during incubation, the information about the sub-goals, or this structural information, control information, fades away, but the facts stay, so they become available to the other sub-goals and promote the finding of a solution. So that's quite a good and powerful explanation of how this illumination can happen. Why do we find? It's not necessarily the right interpretation, but just to give you an idea, so research is still on that, but just to give you an idea how we can create mental mechanisms which can explain something weird, such as an aha experience on a problem, which we just put aside and we do something different. There are also experimental studies on creativity. And one approach to that is that people actually get or are exposed to problems which have been considered to be creative at their times. So for instance, Johannes Kepler, which was like an astronomer, he discovered quite a bit about the motions of planets. And so what Kin and Simon did was they gave the data Kepler had available to describe or to discover the third law of planetary motion, which describes how long does it take for a planet to revolve once around the sun, depending on its distance to the sun. They gave these people the same data, but just changed the context slightly. So instead of distance and period, which we observed in the sky, they just termed it x and y, x and y. And they got the same data and were asked to find a system behind that. So they were exposed to the same situation as Kepler was. And it has been shown that undergraduate students, almost a third of them found the equation in an hour or less. So in a way, you could say, well, that was not a very brilliant insight by Kepler, because the mathematics behind that can be understood by a lot of people in a very short amount of time. However, in the context of time, we have to see these data were not available before that. So he was among the first who was able to discover that. So in a way, looking backwards, is what I meant in the introduction. That, of course, is a creative process, but it's heavily based, or has to be put into the context of time, that it is based upon previous developments, so that we go forward step by step. First, we have to observe the motions, and then we will be able to find the law behind that. Okay, another study by Langley, they had the same logic as participants, actually professional mathematicians and physicists, so who know their math very well, and a slightly more complex problem. Max Planck developed a theory of black body radiation. We don't have to go into any detail here. It's just a rather complex scientific issue here. And almost all participants found the correct equations within 3 minutes. So again, an example that something where we would say, wow, that was really a big discovery, can be recreated nowadays often in a very short time. So creativity has to be put into the context of the time, what has been known at that time. So the conclusion of these studies is, and this is, by the way, no intention to discredit the value of the work of these people. So at these times, these are absolutely brilliant insights. And without all the development and furthering of our understanding which these people have, even if they don't know the exact formula, it may have been a different story as well. So the best thing would have been to give the same data to other scientists at exactly the same time as Max Planck developed that or discovered that, or maybe a couple of weeks later or something. However, still these studies are probably a good indication that there is not too much mysterious processes involved in creativity, and that at least the big majority of creative acts are, or which we consider as creative, are based on common problem-solving strategies, like the use of heuristics, which we spoke about before. Okay, so to summarize the creative process, it has a touch of, as I said, mysterious or mystical things, what happens here. And there is some indication or explanation that you need this unconscious processing, this period of incubation. However, it's hard to investigate scientifically, especially this unconscious processing. And when we look more at the experimental scientific evidence, then we have these self-reports which only partly support this mysterious view and are a bit problematic as well. And we have the experimental studies we just spoke about, which link to a strong link to standard problem solving. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so let's turn to the last aspect on the topic of creativity, and that's speaking about the creative person. And this, of course, is of some interest. So can we identify people who are creative? Is there an inter-individual difference at all in the creativity between people? Can we teach creativity? Things like that. So the basic first question we ask, or in this context, is whether the creative individuals are different from other people. Like, do they have a special talent, which not everybody has? And one idea or conception is that people who are very creative have the ability, or a good ability, to build unusual associations between concepts. So that you link things in a different way, or that you see connections between things which other people don't see. And there is something which gained quite a bit of popular attention, and this is the so-called mad genius hypothesis. And it has been shown that people who are particularly good at that, at finding these associations, they have a higher likelihood, or there's correlation with being diagnosed as manic depressive or schizophrenic. And the other way around, when you look at the occurrence of manic depression and schizophrenia in like everyday people and people who are described as very creative, you have a higher incidence of that in very creative people. So there seems to be some link here, which then gave rise to this idea that, yeah, the mad genius in his laboratory of that. Of course, we always have to think about correlation and causality here. It's probably not that creativity causes schizophrenia or something like that, but instead that the nature of schizophrenia, for instance, results in different thought patterns which just are an advantage to creative thinking. Another question which is really widely discussed and in the interest of in the focus of interest is, what is the role of knowledge for creativity? Previous knowledge about the topic. And that's a bit difficult to propose or hypothesize, because on the one thing we say that creativity is something original and novel. So by definition it is something which goes beyond the current knowledge which is there. So creative products should be somewhat unrelated to knowledge. However, it has been shown that knowledge actually is required to be creative. Without having knowledge, we can't be creative. So knowledge is necessary for creativity. That's the current view. However, too much knowledge can actually be harmful. Again, in this sense of that too much knowledge may restrict our thinking. And again, think back of this functional fixedness, that humans have a tendency, for instance for objects, to perceive the potential uses of an object only as the traditional ones. Like the two-string problem, where people had pliers, we used them to cut, but you could use them also as a weight to swing a rope. And the same thing, if you may have too much theories about certain things, let's say in mathematics, in your mind, this maybe fix you to the theories, and when you get a set of data, you may be a little bit restricted in seeing a pattern which would allow you to create a new theory from the data. And if you wouldn't know the other theories, it may be easier for you to come up with this new interpretation of the data, which should not be taken as an excuse to not learn anything during your study time. So don't say, okay, if I don't learn anything, I will be more creative in the end. You need some knowledge, okay? So, and what you learn in your study time is usually not so much that it will be harmful for your creativity. Okay, so to give an example from the arts, where we have this balance between the requirement for previous knowledge and going beyond that, is when we have new painting techniques which have been developed. For instance, there's this technique which is called pointillism, where a picture is created just by making small dots next to each other, and when you view it from some distance, the colors, for instance, merge and mix, and we see it in a different way. And this was a completely new way of painting, so it was considered to be a really creative thing. However, for the painter who first used that technique, he needed to have some prior knowledge about colors, how to mix them, how they will go together, about how to paint in the first place at all. So you see, we do need previous knowledge usually to be creative. And something closely related to knowledge is experience. And experience, again, seems to help creativity. And knowledge now is really about this factual knowledge, and experience is more this practical, applied knowledge of things. And here we can take examples from music, for instance. And we have Mozart, who undoubtedly have been a really mastermind in creating classical music. However, nowadays, when people look back and say, well, really, this is his first real masterpiece. At that time, he already had 15 years of experience in writing music. And he had a very ambitious father who pushed him into learning music, and Mozart started, for instance, by getting provided musical pieces, and he just changed something and rearranged that. So it was not like a child and he sat down in front of a blank sheet of paper for the first time ever and wrote a perfect symphony. He had a lot of experience before he got to that stage. Another example are the Beatles. And there are often considered two albums to be like the main, where people say, well, these were the main influence on pop music, which really were the most creative or influential products. However, when these albums came out, the Beatles were in the music business already nearly 10 years. Again, they started with mainly covering other songs and only had very few own songs. So it seems to be that experience in something really helps creativity. So be an expert, when you remember the session on expertise, in something to be truly creative. And of course, it is of interest to people whether we can somehow assess the creative potential of people. So, like psychometric tests devise them. And these tests are often based on an idea proposed by Guilford, who proposed two different ways of thinking, which are related to this mad genius hypothesis in the beginning, this idea of being able to create unusual associations. And Guilford distinguished between convergent thinking tasks, and there is basically only one answer acceptable, and these are questions like they are used in conventional IQ tests. So an example would be, what is the highest mountain in the world? Anybody knows that? No. Okay, it's Mount Everest. Okay, and then we have divergent thinking tasks, where many answers are possible, which are like brainstorming tasks, where you have to provide as many answers as possible. And an example could be, what could you use a brick for? So any ideas? What could you use a brick for? You've never seen a use of a brick. Don't tell me that. Okay, you could use it to build buildings. Okay, do you have maybe other ideas? You are an incredibly shy or uncreative lot. So, okay, so you could smash windows with it. Okay, what else? You could use it as a weight in the two-string problem or anything else, or the papers don't fly away. You could use it to attack people. You could use it to defend yourself from attacking people. You could use it as a paperweight. You could use it as a piece of art. Okay. You could use it to pave a way. Okay, and now you have to go on and on and on to show whether you are a divergent thinker or not. And it's especially the abilities in divergent thinking where it's thought that they are related to your creative potential. So they are basically the central element of a lot of tests on creativity. They just test, okay, how can you produce that? And Guilford himself created quite a few of such tests, and he subdivided these different, this divergent thinking into different categories. And one is, it could be divergent production of semantic units. So, for instance, name things that are green and edible. And then you just have to write down as many things as possible. Production of alternative relations. And that is, for instance, in what different ways are a father and a daughter related? How can you put relationships between them? You could say one is older than the other, and things like that. And production of systems. So, for instance, you get 3 words, desert, food, and army, and write as many sentences as possible with these 3 words, which include these 3 words. And you see, it's all this idea of divergent thinking. And it's all based on this idea of getting unusual associations, or, you know, like gathering remote knowledge in a way. However, although it all sounds very plausible and good, when you take other measures of creativity, like really how much creative products have people developed or something like that, there are only weak correlations with these tests. Another approach is the so-called remote associate test. And again, it's the same underlying idea. And here you have three rather remote terms, like cherry, cherry, time, and smell. And what term could be associated with all three of them? So we don't look for a very near and immediately available term, but one which is rather distant. So again, you have to search for unusual and remote associations. And with this test, there are some correlations with measured future creativity. However, these tests also correlate highly with verbal intelligence and general intelligence. So what really is the best predictor of creativity is still a bit unknown and unclear, because you could say, well, it's just general intelligence, and that affects your creativity as well as the performance in this test. Okay, to summarize this aspect on the creative person, we have the mad genius hypothesis, that there is some link between schizophrenia and manic depression and creativity, potentially due to altered thought patterns in these diseases. We have the role of knowledge. We have discussed that some knowledge is helpful, but too much may be actually harmful. And however, experience for sure is always helpful. And we have seen that there are some psychometric tests which, let's say, aim to test for the creative potential, but they seem to be only moderate predictors and correlate highly with other potential factors to creativity. Okay, any questions? Okay, then, oh yeah. I think a general summary on creativity. We have seen that creativity is hard to define, and one of the most standard definitions is that it's the creation of a product which is novel or original to the creator, to that perspective. We've seen that it's hard to investigate, and that we can distinguish these three aspects of creativity. Okay. Before we turn to emotion and cognition, we have a break. Okay, let's continue with the topic of emotions. Okay, so first of all, again, we have to start with a definition of emotions. And a lot of people, when you ask them about emotions to provide a definition, many people will find it difficult to come up with one. And from a psychological perspective, we can define emotions as mind-body responses which are triggered by a stimulus in the environment. So that can be, the stimulus in the environment can be a recognized object which we see, it can be something which is said by another person, or things like that. And then we have a specific mind-body response to that. which is an emotion. Not to every object, we will see in a moment, but we may have. And emotions have a couple of, let's say, unique characteristics which define and describe them. And one is that emotions are usually of short durations. So generally only a few seconds, maybe up to a couple of minutes, but emotions usually don't last like hours or something. Emotions generate a subjective experience, which we have, what we may term the feeling of happiness or sadness or something, for instance. Then there is a strong idea or suggestion that emotions generate action tendencies. So that every emotion is, or most emotions are associated with certain ways to behave or increase the likelihood to behave in a certain way. For instance, when we experience fear, then this tends to increase the probability that we show flight behavior. Disgust, for instance, provokes avoidance behavior. And so we see that emotions may actually have a purpose in controlling our actions or preparing us for certain actions. And another feature is that, that emotions are often accompanied by facial expressions which are recognizable to other people. And it depends a little bit on the emotion itself. Some emotions seem to be universal, so that even across cultures we can identify the expression. Others seem to be more culture specific. So by that we can very quickly and easily communicate our internal state, our feelings, to other people. So it's an important tool for communication. To differentiate, let's have a look what emotions are not, because that is often a little bit confused. And emotions have to be differentiated from mood. And mood is kind of the baseline level of our emotional system or emotional state. So how do we feel when we don't have such a stimulus which make us feel happy or sad? So what's the baseline level? And naturally there are interactions between mood and emotions, so they're not like completely independent systems. So when we are in a very bad mood, then a positive event or a positive stimulus may have a different effect as compared to when we are on an average or slightly positive mood. So if we are in a very bad mood, a positive emotion may have nearly no impact, for instance. Another term to differentiate from is motivation. And motivation is our response to a goal we want to achieve, so to say, while emotion is more an object, our response to an object which we perceive, or a statement or something, a stimulus. So motivation is our drive, the force to achieve a goal which we want to have. So, for instance, if our blood sugar level drops, we may become hungry and we may search for food. And the more intense, so our motivation is this food intake, and the more urgent or attractive the goal is, the more willing we are go for that. So the higher the hunger, the more we will take up to fulfill it, to reach the goal. Okay, so what's the purpose of emotions? And one view is that emotions are basically an old or archaic cognitive system which evaluates information and provides action potential or possibilities of action. So it's information processing, like cognition. And this information processing, because it's an archaic system, we don't have much control over that. So it happens pretty automatic. And the advantage is that emotional responses are very quick. and they're automatic. So they save time, which can be very valuable in our environment. And if we think about the development of the emotional system, then of course we have to think about the development of the human race. And it's only since a couple of 100 years that we don't face dangers like meeting a bear on our way to work, for instance, or something like that. So one mechanism is that the emotional response which we spoke about is a mind-body response. So when we are suddenly standing in front of a bear, then we may get this surprise fear response, which may actually immediately increase adrenaline, which increases heartbeat, muscle tone, so it prepares in a very short amount of time our body for a response, like a flight. So it's very useful for survival in the context of how life has been quite a few years ago. And of course nowadays as well, when we cross the street and missed a car and then suddenly see a car approaching us, we are faster to get off the street by the help of the emotional system. And the idea behind that concept is that emotions are the archaic system, and the high-level cognition, like thinking, planning, and language, is like an add-on which developed afterwards to that system. So, however, these two systems are now totally entangled and work together, and you really can't dissociate that from, of course you can see the different components, but they often don't work independent from each other. And in our everyday life, we notice these two systems and that they are entangled usually only when we get conflicting responses, what to do. So let's return to our example of meeting a bear, and that's something which can even happen to you nowadays if you go like hiking, do a hiking vacation in Canada or something. And if you suddenly stand in front of a bear, you will probably have the emotional response of fear, which tells you to fly, to run away, basically. However, maybe you are a well-prepared person, so you in Canada, you are some national park, so they may have given you a leaflet about how to behave when you meet a bear. And as far as I know, running away is the last thing you should do. And mostly bears, what's the right English word for that? They pretend to attack. So it's an aggressive posture they make. So there's quite a way until they actually attack. So the best way actually is to stand your ground, make yourself big, and pretend you'd attack back. And there's some chances that the bear will just go away because he may not see a reason in actually going into a fight. If that doesn't work, crawl together and just stay still, but don't run away. So having learned that and memorized that because you're a good person, you may have a very different cognitive response. Your emotions say run away, your cognition says stay here. So they have to interact somehow with each other, and your behavior then actually may be influenced by what is stronger, the stronger output of the two. Another example is if often you have the situation in sports, if tempers rise, they know they have high stakes. They may not be allowed to play for a couple of games if they go into a fight, but still, so they have the cognition of don't do that, but the anger and impulsivity of actually going into a fight. So when we look at emotions in a little bit more detail, we see that we can have two different aspects of facets here. And one, we spoke about this already, is the emotional response. So the actual changes taking place in our body and mind. In our body, which we can measure, for instance, in terms of heart rate, skin response, activity in the amygdala, certain brain areas. And then we have the emotional experience. And the idea is the experience is only when we become consciously aware of these changes due to the emotional response. So that we sometimes actually have an emotional response without really becoming consciously aware of that. So there are a lot of stimuli which make us slightly happy, slightly sad, without us realizing that. For instance, music running in the background. So we can differentiate between the emotional response and the actual experience of that. And Phillips suggested a model of how these two things develop, like in time, in response to an emotional stimulus. And let's have a look how that model explains these two things. So it all starts that we encounter some stimulus. And the information of that stimulus is like passed forward to which he called an appraisal module. So, and this module evaluates the emotional significance of that stimulus. So, should this stimulus elicit an emotional response or not? And if so, which? And if the stimulus should elicit an emotional response, then this information is forwarded to which is called the affective state module, which then implements or causes the emotional response. Suppose you have a different stimulus, like a chair. This is also evaluated by the appraisal module. However, usually the chair doesn't carry any emotional value with you, so there's no information about an emotional response forwarded to the affective state module. It just doesn't elicit an emotional response. And this affective state module then produces the current emotional state we are in, like physiological, heart rate, things like that. When we have no emotion, then we are at the baseline level of this affective state module, which is the mood. This process can be regulated. So the affective state module can be regulated. So how strong should be the emotional response be? It can be that our heart rate increases only very slightly or very strongly. And it can be regulated how the appraisal module works. So there are probably situations where, for instance, a chair may become an emotional stimulus. For instance, if you have been in a fight and have been hit by a chair or something like that, then it suddenly becomes a frightening stimulus. Now, this is the emotional response, the emotional state, so the increase in heart rate, for instance. And this is now a funny kind of arrangement here. This emotional response then, it's kind of that our senses pick that up. And it's a little bit like we say, oh, my heart rate is increased. And this sensory feedback informs our consciousness about our emotional state. So very plainly speaking, oh, my heart rate is increased, I must be in fear. And suddenly you have this emotional experience of being in fear. Of course, there's a little bit more to that, so that we actually really have the experience. It's not just we realize heart rate, but that's the basic idea. And this conscious, or this emotional experience, which is conscious to us, then enables top-down regulation as well. So for instance, an example for that would be you are such a player on the playing field and you think the other person did a foul, but the referee didn't see that, so your temper may rise, and you realize that, and then you say, okay, calm down. So that's a way how we can modulate how our emotional response is by the feedback of the emotional experience. There is, when we look at the different emotions which are there, like happiness, sadness, and there are lots of emotions, and actually there is a discussion about what states constitute an emotion or not. So there are like the feelingness of guilty, pride, which are usually considered to be emotions, but there are borderline cases where there is argument about is that an emotion or not. And one differentiation between these different types of emotions which we have is whether emotions are basic, that means inbuilt, inborn, innate in everybody, so the same for every human being, or whether they are ontogenetic, that means developed, culturally influenced. We come to life without an inborn neural circuitry for, let's say, pride, but that is something which is shaped during our development by our parents and culture. And these basic emotions are thought to be innate, as I said. So, and one of the main or first proponents of that was Paul Ekman, and he did studies on facial expressions of emotions. And what he did was he compared that across cultures. And he said if all cultures are able to tell by a picture of a person what that emotion is reliably, then this must be universal. And he found 6 emotions where he claimed they are universal. Initially he claimed that. He extended that to some more emotions. One is fear. So with what we have seen, the action tendency mainly to flee, anger with the action tendency to fight, disgust, happiness, sadness, and surprise. So it's assumed, or there is, let's say, it's still quite a bit of a debate going on whether we really have basic emotions or not and which are really among them. But there's a rather good consensus that these 6 emotions are, let's say, cross-culturally universal. And no matter to whom you go, that they will recognize these emotions from your facial expression, for instance. And he is quite famous for the facial stimuli he used in his studies. And these are the 6 basic emotions we have just seen, and we can just try that. So what is that emotion? What would you say? That's supposed to be anger, if you think about this. This one, if you remember, we have anger, we have fear, we have surprise, disgust, happiness, and sadness. So this is anger. Of the other ones, is this happiness? Yeah, fear. That's fear. This? Disgust. Surprise, happiness, sadness. Yeah. So, and if you present pictures like that to different cultures, most people are pretty good in recognizing these emotions. Of course, he had many pictures of different people displaying anger. And he went then to people who lived really cut off of Western civilization, somewhere in the rainforest or something. And he asked them as well, first of all, to rate these, but also to make a happy face, like this, and an angry face. And Ekman went well beyond that, and he described a facial activity coding system where it's linked to certain muscles. So every emotion has a certain description of which muscles in the face are active in a way, so that can be more objectively described. And he has shown that there's, for these 6 emotions at least, pretty good convergence, even with these people who had never TV, who had really virtually never met Westerners and things like that, so that he really said that seems to be inborn, basically. Ontogenetic emotions are basically non-basic emotions, and well, I have the examples pride and guilt, but I've just seen that I think later on Ekman at least would say that these might actually be inborn emotions as well. So it's a matter of discussion here. And as I said, they emerge during development by learning of things, and there may be cross-cultural differences in their expressions. So that certain things here, like pride, may be expressed differently in an American society as compared to a Japanese society, for instance. Okay, to summary this introduction to emotions, we've seen that emotions are mind-body responses which are triggered by a stimulus in the environment. They have a short duration, only usually a couple of seconds, up to a few minutes, and they generate feeling, the subjective experience. They generate action tendencies and prepare us for the most likely proper action, and they are usually accompanied by recognizable facial expressions. And even the ontogenetic ones are recognizable within this culture. So even if pride and guilt are not inborn within one cultural group, they are recognizable expressions with that. And we've seen that emotions are different to mood and motivation, and the idea is that emotions serve as a basic cognitive system. And we spoke about that, the differentiation between inborn and learned emotions. Any questions on that? Okay. Now let's speak a little bit more directly about the link between emotion and cognition. And they're not independent systems from each other, as I mentioned already, but instead closely interact. And as a first example, when you think about this model we spoke about, we have seen that the emotional response affects our cognition, our conscious processing. And our conscious processing, cognition, can influence the regulation of emotions. Another example is that when you try to remember something very intense, like a first kiss, your wedding, the birth of your child, or something like that, then usually you don't just remember the factual elements of that, but the emotion comes up as well. So in long-term memory, we have kind of an associated storage of emotion and factual knowledge, episodic memory. And one important person who created or showed or proved a link between emotion and cognition was Joseph LeDoux. And what he did was basically learning a fear response, classical conditioning of a fear response. And the idea here is that we have a neural circuit in our brain for the fear response. And we have certain stimuli which activate this fear response, like a bear. And we have certain stimuli, like a neutral sound, which do not activate the fear response. Now, when you present these two together quite a few times, then after some time, the sound also will activate the fear response. This, of course, is closely related to the classical conditioning of Pavlov's dog, where we have the food and that. What is new about that you cross systems. You have a cognitive component, a neutral sound, and an emotional response. So you can condition emotions as well. And that's basically based on two different systems, brain systems in this example. One's for emotions, the other one's for cognition. And that demonstrates that there is a strong link between the two systems. Another example which illustrates how emotions or images or stimuli with emotional value can influence our perception is a very basic task. It's a detection task in perception, and you always see an array of 9 images, and let's say 8 of them contain different flowers and 1 a spider. So And they used other relevant stimuli like snakes as well, and flowers or mushrooms maybe unrelated to fear. And now what they varied is whether you have an array where 8 of the stimuli are non-fear stimuli and 1 is the fear stimulus, or the other way around. So you may have 8 spiders and 1 flower here. And what has been shown is that when you have 1 fear eliciting stimulus among a lot of others, you're faster in your responses as compared to this situation where you have to find the odd one out. And I thought that an emotional stimulus, in particular one which is relevant for fear, draws your attention to it. And that's another example that the emotional value of a stimulus influences where we direct our attention, which is a purely cognitive process, at least as we spoke about that so far. It has also been shown that emotions influence the ways we make decisions. And this is a little bit indirect evidence, not directly cognitive, but from patients which suffer from prefrontal lesions. And the prefrontal cortex is associated, among other things, with the processing of emotions. So participants had to do a task which is a little bit like a gambling task. You have 4 decks of cards, playing cards, and you have a fictional bank account of $2,000 or pounds. And you always have to pick up 1 card at a time and in any of those packs. And depending on the card, you may get money or you may lose money. You may win or you may lose. And your goal is, as you may imagine, just to win as much money as possible. Now, the important experimental manipulation was that I said you had 4 decks, 4 piles of cards. That each pile or each deck of card was designed to either, on average, win you money or lose you money. So there are good packs and bad packs. Then they measured the skin conductance, which is a measure of arousal, and we'll see that in a moment. That's linked to emotions. And so this is basically the layout, the setup, what they had. And now what happens after a couple of trials? Normal participants will realize, okay, we have good packs and we have bad packs, and they will try to avoid the 2 bad packs, which lose their money. And what they also show is a difference in skin conductance as when they take a card from the good pack as compared to the bad pack. So they have emotional value attached to the packs, which you can actually measure in the emotional response, in the physiological response. So when you're about to lose something, your skin conductance, your arousal may go up, and when you're about to have a happy event that you probably win something, you are more relaxed. However, the patients with the prefrontal lesions did not show such differences. So they somehow have lost the ability to compute the emotional value of that. And that, of course, affects how they pick the cards from the decks. So when we have to make decisions, and the decisions are somewhat based on, or these decisions can be based on the emotional value of things. Okay. Now, so far, we have spoken or seen that negative emotions influence our behavior. And that makes some sense, because negative emotions, you can say, are a system to detect a threat to us. So it's really very viable that we are good at detecting that, like the fear response. We should detect that quickly, because that's danger to us. But what about positive emotions? Because there is no positive threats in a way, so we don't need such a warning system here. And it has been shown that when we have the link to cognitive psychology, that positive emotions can facilitate complex cognitive operations like problem solving. this is now strongly linked to our cognition topic here. In social interactions, positive emotions, of course, have a purpose of like approach. So when I'm happy, I'm more easily approach other people, and I'm showing approachability to other people. So positive emotions are quite important for the social fabric and to create coherence and bonding between people. But now we're speaking about the cognitive aspects of that. So this has been shown for like problem-solving situations and decision-making. Another example to illustrate the link between emotions and cognition is cognitive therapy, like Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy to treat depression. And I'm a bit slow today, so I want to rush a little bit through that so that we can get done can finish our lecture in time. And you may actually be familiar with that therapy anyway. The idea is that in, for instance, depression, the incoming perceptual information is systematically interpreted in a negative way. So we have a distorted thought pattern, and positive information is not considered. So this is information where we always attach a negative emotional response to that. And the therapy aims at basically relabeling thoughts so that we get a different emotion to the same percept. And for that, patients have to monitor all their thought patterns, and any negative thought eliciting a negative emotion must be tested for validity. And whether that's really the case, statements like, "I've never done anything positive by working," so that slowly you will realize your thought patterns are wrong and you have to rethink, and you start to think in a new way. So in a way, emotions and cognition closely interact in CBT as well. Okay, to summarize that part, emotion and cognition are not independent. Of course, you can find or create situations where you have purely cognitive acts which are not influenced by emotion, and you have purely emotional responses which are not influenced by cognition. But that still doesn't mean that the two systems are not strongly interlinked with each other. And we have seen that cognition can modulate the emotional response, something like, "I have to calm down," or in cognitive behavioral therapy, "I don't need to be worried about that," or "I shouldn't be disappointed by that." We've also seen that emotions can affect the speed and accuracy of perceptual detection, for instance, of threat stimuli, of problem solving and decision making. And finally, we have seen the example to apply this knowledge to the development of psychotherapeutical approaches. Okay, any questions on that topic? Okay, now the last bit for today is dealing with some theories of emotion. And when we speak about theories, we will discover that there are many different theories of emotions, and of course there's quite a debate of how that works, or what's the best one or the right one. And the theories actually differ quite a bit in their nature. So some theories may merely aim to classify emotions, so we have different classification systems. Others aim at explaining emotions. And here we may have theories, models, mechanisms, how emotions come about. And they really have quite profound differences here in the classification. And already in the set of emotions they deal with. So some theories only cover a couple of emotions, and in the way they explain that. Okay, so let's have a look at some basic descriptors when we want to classify them. One way to describe emotions is by their valence. And that means whether an emotion has a positive or a negative character. So positive valence or negative valence. And positive emotions are typically associated with reward or approach, and negative emotions are typically associated with an aversive state or punishment or like rejection, avoidance behavior. Another dimension to describe emotions is arousal. And this is really the physiological intensity of an emotion. So the amount to which our autonomous nervous system is activated. So does our heart rate change slightly up or down, or profoundly up or down, for instance? And it has been argued and shown as well that the pattern of responses of our nervous system is specific to emotions. So that if you measure quite a few parameters, you can have quite good guesses what the actual emotion is. That doesn't work perfectly, of course, far from perfect, but there is some relation here. And another, so this is one idea, is that emotions are discrete categories. So what we already discovered, we have this set of basic innate emotions, and they are discrete categories, like fear, anger, disgust. They don't have to do anything with each other. And each basic emotion has its like unique neural activity, its unique response in the autonomous nervous system, and therefore can be categorized. An opposed view to this categorical approach is our so-called dimensional models. So that we have continuous dimensions and emotions are arranged on these dimensions. We will see an example in a moment. So that emotions are actually not discrete categories, but they can be, they fall on smooth continuums of dimensions, like valence and arousal. And this is quite a debate in the literature. What is the right thing? Categorical approach or dimensional approach? So an example for dimensional models, one is the so-called circumplex model proposed by Russell. And here we have two dimensions, and the emotions are classified in a circular way on these dimensions. So the first dimension is valence, so whether it's either pleasant or unpleasant. That means everything left to the center point are unpleasant emotions, like being alarmed, tense, afraid, frustrated, miserable, droopy. And here we have positive emotions: aroused, excited, delighted, happy, glad, calm, sleepy, things like that. The other dimension is the arousal, the amount of activation we have. And you see, when the arousal is very low, we have states like sleepy, tired, droopy, bored, calm, relaxed, satisfied. And with very high arousal, it's astonished, alarmed, afraid, things like that. So that by saying, okay, if a very pleasant and very high arousal state is excited, so you can arrange that here. So if you just tell a person the arousal and valence value, they can tell you what emotion it is. This is just another dimensional model taken from the textbook, where we have more dimensions. So where we have negative effect, whether it's low or high, and positive effect, high positive and low positive effect. And then we have like disengagement and strong engagement is basically the arousal dimension, and pleasantness and unpleasantness is the valence dimension. And when you go into the literature on emotions, you will see that you have a lot of different terms which may be used synonymously but may not by other authors. So some would say this is positive valence, which he calls here pleasant, and this is negative valence, unpleasantness. So it's a bit tricky to get a good understanding of the literature in emotion. There are many different variations of these dimensional models. So Wilhelm Wundt already in 1897 proposed such a dimensional approach with 3 dimensions: pleasurable, unpleasurable, arousing, subduing, and you see valence and arousal again, and strain, relaxation as a 3rd dimension. Other models put here dominance. How much am I in control of the situation or want to control the situation? A completely different approach to dimension is based on neurotransmitters. How much dopamine, serotonin, or noradrenaline do I have in my body, or activity in the brain? So just not going into details, but just showing or giving a slight idea about the amount of theories about emotions which is out there. Then we have a further category of models and theories, and these are appraisal models. And we already have seen such an appraisal model here. And the idea here is that the emotion which is created is based on our appraisal of a situation or a stimulus. And these models are quite good in explaining why the same stimulus or event can have different emotions in different people. So suppose you get your cognitive psychology exam back and you got a B. Some people will be devastated, others will be so joyful and happy about the B that they can't believe that. It's the same thing, same stimulus, but very different responses to that. And these appraisal modules are very good in that, because they take into account, for instance, the history and the personality of the person. If you always have D's only, then you are happy about a B, of course. Okay. Another appraisal model is where, again, we have different criteria, again, not going into too much detail here, where we try to classify that. And you see we have agency here as one dimension or domain, so whether it's caused by others, certain, uncertain, and we have whether it's consistent with our motives, whether it's weak or strong, so the power, intensity, and then we can try to classify the emotions here in this grid, so to say. Okay, I think the last thing I would like to speak about, and one reason is that it's a very popular view, especially among lay people, is MacLean's triune brain theory. And this is Paul MacLean who suggested that around the 1960s. However, there was a rather popular book in the 1990s called The Triune Brain in Evolution. And his idea is, and this is from the nowadays perspective, a very simplistic view, and because it's so simplistic and makes so much sense for people, it's often picked up by lay people. But as we will see, it's really not fully correct. And the basic idea is that the brain is made up of 3 layers, and each layer reflects an evolutionary stage. So we have our reptilian brain, the limbic system, and the neocortex. So to represent that schematically, the first oldest layer is the reptilian brain, here denoted as A, and here is A in green. And this is very basic automatic behavior, such as regulating vital parameters of survival, very low level reflex-like responses and things like that. Then we have the second layer here called B, and here in red, which is the limbic system. And as we have seen, it's assumed to be a simple form of cognition, archaic system. It's our emotional system nowadays, where we have more complex behavior than here. And then we have the third layer, which is here C and here in blue, the neocortex, which then allows us to use symbols and abstract concepts and things like that. So cognition, more advanced cognition, basically. And he says that all these functions are still present in our brain. So still the old reptilian functions are there, and still the limbic functions. And there is, in the theory, there is of course some element of how information flows between the different parts and how they interact with each other. And according to that theory, we can explain, let's say, non-rational behavior by evolutionary old programs which take over control. So that even in England, in nowadays society, that we have a high proportion of people who are afraid of spiders and snakes and things like that, although there are no poisonous spiders and snakes in this area, is explained by this thing that in an evolutionary context, there have been hundreds of thousands or millions of years to monkeys, and even predating that, where spiders have been an actual threat to that, and it's still coded. That would be the explanation of that. But while it is very appealing due to its simplicity, it's not very widely embraced or accepted in the scientific community. So it is by far a too simplistic view. And it is by far no clear that the three layers really developed during evolution in that clear stage. So there is evidence that you have already in reptiles structures which are like neocortex. So it's not that they only had their limbic system and nothing else. And again, reptiles show behavior which is too complex to say it's just reptilian brain, things like that. And when you look in more detail at the cortex in the brain, in the human brain, you will find many transitional cortices which show characteristics of both. And so the story is unfortunately much more complex and complicated as laid out here. Okay, to summarize, and then we are at the end for today. We have seen that there are many, many different theories of emotions, and this was really just a small sample of the theories which are out there. And one of the fundamental distinguishing features is whether we speak about categories of basic emotions or whether we speak about dimensional models. And we have these appraisal theories which are somewhat independent of that. Often, the concept of emotion, what is an emotion, how is it represented, is a matter of discussion. Okay, do you have any questions on that part? Okay, then thanks for coming. We skip that summary, and next week we meet again with the last, let's say, proper lecture on the two topics of decision making and social cognition. Okay, see you next week. Thanks for coming.